The locked door. I moved into a cheap apartment near my college campus because, well, it was all I could afford. The area wasn't great. Run-down buildings, shady neighbors, and I swear I heard sirens almost every night. But it was close to school, and that mattered more than anything. At first, I told myself the unease I felt was just nerves. New place, new routine. It was normal to feel off, right? The first night I checked the door locks maybe 3 or 4 times before I went to bed. I've always been a bit paranoid about that stuff, and this neighborhood wasn't exactly helping. The building itself was old, with creaky floors and thin walls. I could hear everything my neighbors did, even though no one really spoke to me. It felt like people kept to themselves here. I shrugged it off. Everyone was just minding their own business. But then I started noticing things. Small things at first, like my keys being moved from the counter to the table, or my shoes facing the wrong direction. I convinced myself I was just tired from classes, that I was misremembering, but the feeling that something was off settled in. I couldn't shake it. One night, after triple-checking the door locks like always, I climbed into bed and tried to fall asleep. That's when I heard it. A soft creaking noise, like footsteps coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was one of my neighbors, but it sounded too close, like it was right outside my door. I held my breath, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding. After what felt like forever, I got up the nerve to look through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I tried to laugh it off, chalking it up to paranoia. But later that night, I had the most unsettling dream. Someone was standing over me, just staring. They didn't move or say anything. They were just there, watching me sleep. When I woke up, I felt disoriented. But what really freaked me out was that my phone was on the other side of the room. I always left it charging on my nightstand, and there was no reason it should have moved. That's when I saw it, the front door lock. It didn't look quite right. It was barely noticeable, but it looked like someone had messed with it. My stomach dropped, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. I had to be. There was no way someone had actually been in my apartment, except the feeling wouldn't go away. Over the next few days, the anxiety built. I felt watched, not just at night, but during the day too. I started inspecting the apartment, looking for signs that someone had been inside. I found nothing, but it didn't make me feel better. I started leaving the lights on at night, hoping that would stop whatever was happening. Then it happened again. I was lying in bed, struggling to sleep, when I heard it, a faint clicking sound. The door. Someone was unlocking my door. I froze, my whole body tense with fear. Then, the soft creak of the floor followed. Someone was in my apartment. I squeezed my eyes shut, pretending to sleep. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. All I could do was listen as the footsteps approached my bedroom. The door cracked open. I could feel them standing there, could feel the weight of their presence, and I swear I could hear their breathing. Time seemed to stretch on forever before I finally heard the steps retreating. Then, the door quietly clicked shut. I didn't move until the sun came up. When I did, I scoured the apartment for any sign of the intruder. Everything looked normal, except on the floor, right in the middle of the room, was a single strand of my hair. I felt sick. I knew it wasn't mine, at least not where I'd left it. Someone had been in here, watching me. That's when I started suspecting my landlord. He was an odd guy, never really talked to me, but I had this gut feeling that he was involved. It didn't make sense at first, but why else would my locks look tampered with? I tried to shake the thought, but I couldn't. Desperate to know the truth, I set up a small hidden camera in the living room, pointing directly at the front door. I figured if someone was really coming in, I'd catch them. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I just lay there, waiting for something to happen. The next day, I checked the footage, and my heart dropped. There, clear as day, was my landlord, using a key to unlock my door. He walked in casually, like he owned the place, and started moving things around. Not stealing, not searching, just moving. He'd place a book on the table or leave a drawer slightly open. Then he went into my bedroom, stood over me for what felt like hours, and just watched. He didn't touch me, didn't say anything. He just stood there. And then, before he left, he looked directly at the camera. I was frozen. My mind raced with what to do. Should I confront him? Call the police? But what if he denied it? What if he got angry? The thought of being in the same room with him made me feel sick. That night, I pushed a chair against the door, but I didn't sleep. I started looking for a new apartment immediately, but I couldn't move right away. I had to endure a few more nights in that place, each one worse than the last. I barely slept, always listening for the sound of the door unlocking. One night, I heard the click again, but this time, no one came inside. I lay there, paralyzed, waiting for hours. But nothing happened. Eventually, I moved out. But the fear stayed with me. Every little noise in my new place makes my heart race. I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me, waiting. I never confronted the landlord. I couldn't. And now I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. Sometimes I still hear that faint click in the dead of night. And every time, I wonder if it's starting all over again. I don't usually post stories like this, but something happened to me a few years ago that I haven't been able to shake. Even now, when I think about it, my heart races. I guess I'm sharing this to warn others. If something feels off, trust your instincts. You never know what could be hiding behind a seemingly normal situation. I was 17, just about to finish high school. I had a pretty routine life: school, part-time job at a local coffee shop, and weekends spent hanging out with my small group of friends. I wasn't the most popular kid, but I got along with most people. So when Eric, this guy from another class, started talking to me, it didn't seem like a big deal. Eric was chill, easygoing, and he seemed to have connections with people I didn't know. At first, I thought it was cool. I felt like I was stepping out of my comfort zone, meeting new people through Eric. But there was always something about him that seemed off. He made this weird comment once, something like, "You'll meet people who don't really exist." I laughed it off at the time, but the way he said it stuck with me. A few weeks later, Eric invited me to a house party. I wasn't sure about it. I'm not really into parties, but he insisted, saying it'd be a good time. I felt uneasy about it, but eventually, I agreed. I figured, what's the worst that could happen? The house was on the edge of town, a bit further than I was used to going. When I got there, the place was packed. People were crammed into every room, drinking and talking. But something felt strange. No one seemed to know who the host was. Everyone I talked to was there because someone else had invited them, but no one had any clear answers. There was this weird, jittery energy in the air, like everyone was waiting for something. It wasn't your typical loud, fun party. It was awkward, like nobody really wanted to be there. I tried to brush it off, figuring I was just overthinking things. I hadn't seen Eric since I arrived, but I figured he was just busy. As I wandered through the house, a guy brushed past me in the hallway, muttering something under his breath. "Keep quiet," he said, and before I could react, he was gone, lost in the crowd. My stomach dropped. Why would he say that? I started feeling more anxious, but I didn't want to cause a scene. I decided I'd find Eric, hang out for a bit, and then leave. That's when I overheard two people talking in a room nearby. "We can't let anyone find out," one of them said. "Not with all that stuff in the basement." My heart raced. I didn't know what they were talking about, but the way they said it scared me. I hadn't seen Eric for what felt like hours, and it was starting to freak me out. I was too far from home to walk and my phone was almost dead. I couldn't call anyone for a ride, and leaving by myself didn't feel safe. I thought about just slipping out quietly, but I felt trapped. I noticed groups of people heading downstairs, whispering to each other. That pit in my stomach kept getting deeper. Finally, I saw Eric again. He was acting like nothing was wrong, smiling and laughing, but something about him seemed forced. I tried to tell him I wanted to leave, but he just laughed it off. "Relax," he said. "You're overthinking it. Just enjoy the night." The way he brushed me off made me feel like I was the one going crazy. I didn't want to stay, but I didn't want to leave without him either. I wandered around the house, trying to find an exit that wasn't crowded. That's when I found a small hidden door in the back of the house, slightly ajar. Curiosity got the best of me, and I peeked inside. I saw two men, the same ones I'd overheard earlier, dragging what looked like heavy duffel bags into a side room. My breath caught in my throat. There was something seriously wrong happening in that house. I backed away slowly, but just as I turned to leave, someone grabbed my arm. It was Eric. His face wasn't the friendly, easygoing one I knew. It was cold, serious. "Don't say anything," he whispered. "Just leave." Quietly. It wasn't a suggestion. It felt like a threat. My heart pounded as I pulled away from him and headed for the door. I tried not to look suspicious, but all I could think about was the basement and what those men were doing. As I reached the front door, I glanced back one last time. The basement door was open now, and I could see inside. One of the men was holding a handgun, arguing with someone. I didn't wait to hear more. I bolted out of the house and didn't stop running until I was blocks away. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but it died right then. I felt completely alone, standing in the dark, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I didn't know what was going on in that house, but I knew it wasn't anything good. It wasn't until later, as I was catching my breath, that it hit me. I never saw anyone else leave the party. The next few days were strange. I kept expecting to hear something. Police reports, rumors, anything. But there was nothing. It was like the party never happened. Eric never contacted me again, and I didn't reach out either. It was like he'd disappeared from my life as quickly as he'd entered it. No one I talked to seemed to remember the party, or they acted like it was just a normal night. But I knew better. I've never gone to another party since that night. The image of the basement, of Eric's face, still haunts me. I keep thinking that I narrowly avoided something terrible, but I'll never know for sure. So, if you ever feel like something isn't right, trust your gut. If I hadn't, I don't know where I'd be now. I had been cleaning out my garage last month, trying to clear space after moving to a quieter neighborhood. I found an old bike tucked away in the corner, something I hadn't used in years. It was still in good shape, so I decided to put it up for sale on Craigslist. I've done it before, selling random things without any problems. I always meet buyers in public places because you can't be too careful these days. Lately, though, I've been feeling uneasy. It started as just small things, a weird feeling when I walk down the street at night, or noticing someone staring for a little too long in the grocery store. There were even a few times I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing. I chalked it up to paranoia. Maybe I'd been watching too many crime documentaries. Anyway, I pushed the feelings aside when I got a reply to my Craigslist ad from a guy who seemed normal enough. He wanted to meet in a park nearby, and we agreed to meet the next day. The morning of the sale, I loaded the bike into my car and headed to the park. It was a bright day, the kind that makes everything feel safer than it really is. There were a few people around, families, dog walkers, so I didn't feel too nervous. I kept thinking to myself, it's just a quick sale. I'll be in and out in no time. When I saw the buyer, a man in his late 40s, a little scruffy but not alarming, I felt okay about the whole thing. He walked up to me and shook my hand. The conversation started off fine. He seemed interested in the bike, checking the tires and asking standard questions about how long I'd had it. But then, his questions started getting strange. He asked if I came alone. I didn't think much of it at first, but when he followed up with, "Do you live around here?" I started to feel uneasy. Something about his tone made my skin crawl. Then came the part that really set me off. He told me he didn't have enough cash on him and suggested we walk over to his van, which was just parked around the corner. Immediately, alarm bells started going off in my head. There was something about the way he said it, too casual, but also too insistent. I politely refused and offered to meet him at an ATM, but he kept pushing, saying it wouldn't take long if we just went to his van. I felt a wave of dread wash over me. My gut was telling me to get out of there fast. I told him I had to get going and would contact him later about the sale, then quickly turned toward my car. He didn't say anything, but I could feel him watching me as I walked away. As I got in my car, I noticed a white van pulling up near the entrance of the park, exactly where he said it was parked. The same guy was now in the driver's seat, waving me over with a smile that didn't feel friendly anymore. My heart was pounding. I didn't even hesitate. I pulled out of the parking lot and started driving away. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and there it was, the van, following me. At first, I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just heading the same way, but the more I drove, the more it became obvious that wasn't the case. Every turn I made, the van followed. My mind raced as I thought about pulling over or calling someone, but I didn't want to stop. Fear took over, and I started speeding up, hoping to lose him in traffic. No matter how fast I drove, the van stuck with me, weaving between cars to stay close. My heart raced, and my palms were slick with sweat. I kept glancing in the mirror, trying to find a way out, but every turn seemed to lead to more isolation. The streets that should have been busy felt empty, like I was being funneled into a trap. I reached for my phone, but my hands were shaking too much to dial. I made a sharp turn onto a small side street, barely wide enough for my car. The van followed, headlights glaring. I felt trapped. I had to make a decision fast, so I gunned it down the narrow alleyway, scraping the sides of my car against the walls. For a moment, there was silence. I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd lost him. But then, I saw the headlights at the alley's entrance. He wasn't giving up. The van stopped, and for a second, we just sat there, staring at each other. Then I heard the engine rev, and the van inched forward. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't back up. The alley was too tight, so I floored the gas, my car lurching forward, barely squeezing through. I scraped the side mirrors against the walls as I shot out onto the next street, finally losing sight of the van behind me. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station. My hands were trembling as I parked the car, my breath coming in short gasps. I scanned the area, half expecting the van to appear out of nowhere, but it didn't. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. Just as I stepped out of the car to catch my breath, another vehicle pulled in behind me. My heart skipped a beat until I saw it was just another customer. Or was it? Eventually, I drove home, locking the door behind me and checking the windows every few minutes. The house felt too quiet, and every creak made my skin crawl. Even though I had escaped, I couldn't shake the fear that he might still be out there, looking for me. Every time headlights passed by my window that night, I wondered if they would stop outside. I haven't listed anything on Craigslist since, and I still can't walk through my neighborhood without feeling like someone's watching. Maybe they are. I've been debating whether to share this or not, but I can't shake the feeling that maybe someone else has gone through something similar, and maybe talking about it could help me process it. This happened a few months ago, and I still can't fully move past it. For context, I'm in my late 20s and work in an office. My hours can be unpredictable, so I got into the habit of going to a 24-hour gym late at night, usually after 10 p.m. It's convenient because it's less crowded, and I've always felt safe there. The gym is brightly lit, clean, and while it's not packed with people at that hour, there's usually a few regulars. Lately, though, I started noticing the place was getting quieter. Maybe it was the colder weather, or maybe I just didn't realize how few people showed up that late. At first, I shrugged it off. It wasn't until I noticed a man who seemed to be there every night, just sitting in the corner, that I started feeling uneasy. He didn't seem to be working out, he was just there. One night, I was doing my usual workout, moving from machine to machine. I noticed that every time I switched, the man followed, always a few steps behind, watching. At first, I told myself it was just coincidence. People switch machines all the time, right? But it kept happening, and my anxiety started to build. I tried to ignore him, convincing myself I was overreacting. Maybe he didn't even realize he was following me. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next few nights, it only got worse. He showed up every single time I did, but never touched the equipment. He just watched. I decided to start going an hour earlier, hoping to avoid him, but he was still there. It was like he knew my schedule, and no matter how I tried to avoid him, he found me. One night, as I was finishing up my workout, I caught him staring at me while I walked toward the locker room. His eyes didn't move. He didn't even try to hide that he was watching. I started to get scared. My routine changed. I skipped machines I normally used, stayed in crowded areas, and tried to leave earlier. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake him. One night, I was finishing up on the treadmill when he finally approached me. "You come here a lot, don't you?" he asked. His voice was calm, casual, as if we had been chatting for weeks. I tried to play it off, answering quickly, "Yeah, I guess," and turned to grab my things. "I've seen you around," he added with this weird smile. His tone was off, too familiar for someone I'd never spoken to before. I forced a smile, mumbled something about being in a rush, and walked away as fast as I could without making it obvious I was scared. I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. After that, things escalated. Every time I left the gym, his car would be parked next to mine in the lot. It was a small, dimly lit area, and seeing his car so close to mine sent my anxiety through the roof. I didn't know if he was doing it on purpose or if it was another twisted coincidence, but it felt intentional. It felt like he was closing in on me. I started carrying pepper spray in my gym bag, but it didn't make me feel any safer. Then, one night, everything came to a head. The gym was almost empty, and as I glanced in the mirror, I saw him standing way too close to me. He wasn't using the machines. He was just standing there, watching. My heart dropped. I grabbed my things and left without even finishing my workout. When I stepped outside, I froze. His car was parked directly behind mine, completely blocking me in. The parking lot was deserted, and there was no one around to help. My hands were shaking as I walked toward my car, trying to keep calm, but my mind was racing. I knew something was very wrong. I reached for my keys and tried to act normal, but my heart was pounding. Before I could get into my car, I heard his voice. "Hey, do you need help?" he called out. His voice calm, too calm for the situation. I didn't even respond. I just locked myself inside my car as fast as I could. My fingers were trembling as I dialed 911. I could barely explain what was happening to the dispatcher. My words were all jumbled. I watched him through the window as he casually walked toward my car, that sick smile still on his face, like he knew he had me trapped. The dispatcher told me to stay calm and that help was on the way, but I felt anything but calm. He was pacing around my car, tapping on the window every few seconds like he was testing how far he could go. His car was still blocking mine. Even if the police came, I didn't know how I would get out. It felt like hours before I saw the flashing lights in the distance. The man looked up, saw the lights, and without a word, walked back to his car and drove off. The police took my statement, but by the time they arrived, he was long gone. They told me he probably just made a mistake parking, that maybe he didn't realize what he was doing. But I knew better. I stopped going to that gym at night after that, and eventually, I stopped going altogether. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. Every time I see a car like his, my stomach twists in knots. I moved to a new place, got a new routine, but every now and then, when I'm driving alone, I swear I still see his car in my rearview mirror. Night shift. I never really thought much about the job. Being a night shift security guard in an office building sounded easy. I had done this type of work for years, mostly just sitting at a desk, checking cameras, and walking the empty halls a few times during the night. The building itself was nothing special, just your typical corporate space. Long hallways, fluorescent lights that buzzed in the silence, and rows of cubicles left behind when the day staff clocked out. Most nights, nothing happened. I'd walk around, maybe grab a cup of coffee, and glance at the cameras now and then. The hardest part of the job was staying awake. It wasn't scary, just lonely. But there were small things that, over time, began to bother me. At first, it was nothing too strange. A door that wasn't closed properly, or a coffee mug in the break room moved when I hadn't touched it. I told myself I must have just forgotten something, or maybe someone from the cleaning staff left it like that. But these things kept happening, and they started to stick in my mind. Little by little, it made me uncomfortable, but I brushed it off as paranoia. One night, everything changed. It was a quiet shift, like any other. I was halfway through my rounds when I heard it. A soft, steady sound of footsteps. They were faint but unmistakable, coming from the upper floor. I stopped to listen, thinking I was imagining it. But then the footsteps came again. This time, I was sure they were separate from my own. The upper floor should have been empty. There was no reason anyone would be up there at that hour. I went to the security office and checked the cameras. All the feeds looked normal, nothing moved. Just the usual, empty hallways, silent offices. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That feeling of being watched gnawed at me. I tried to ignore it, but each time I walked the halls, I found myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone behind me. Later that night, after my second round, I saw it. One of the office doors on the upper floor was slightly open. I knew for a fact it had been closed earlier. My stomach tightened. I pushed the door open, half expecting to find someone inside, but it was empty. The only thing out of place was a computer screen that was on, displaying a live feed from one of the security cameras, the one pointed at my desk. I felt a chill run down my spine. From that night on, it only got worse. Objects moved more often. A coffee mug I had placed on the break room table would somehow find its way back to my desk. One night, I noticed that a computer I'd shut down was suddenly powered on again. The building began to feel less like an empty office and more like a place I was trapped in. I started watching the security feeds more carefully, but nothing showed up. Everything looked normal, but I knew it wasn't. I began questioning myself. Was I losing it? Was I just imagining all this? I considered calling the police, but the idea seemed ridiculous. "Hey, officer, my coffee cup moved, and I think someone's watching me." No, I couldn't do that. The thought of quitting crossed my mind, but I needed the job. I had bills to pay, and it wasn't like I could afford to just walk away, so I stayed. But each night, my nerves grew worse. The sounds, the flickering lights, the feeling of being watched, They all kept building up. One night, I heard a faint click, like a door closing softly, but there was no reason for any door to be open or closed at that time. That was the night I finally saw something. I was going through the camera footage, just like usual, when I saw it. Something moved. A shadow, or maybe a person, darted across the screen, just barely out of view. My heart raced. I rewound the footage, but it was gone. Nothing. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something, or someone, was in the building. I grabbed my flashlight and decided to check it out. I walked through the halls, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. My heart pounded in my chest. The building felt different, the silence heavier than before. Every small sound, the hum of the air conditioning, the clink of metal, felt louder, sharper. When I got to the area where I'd seen the figure, the lights flickered. I heard it again, the sound of typing, faint but unmistakable. I followed the noise to a small office. Inside, the laptop was on, displaying a live feed from the security cameras. My camera, the one pointed at my desk. Panic flooded my chest. Someone had been watching me the entire time. I checked the room, no sign of anyone. They were gone, but the fear remained. I rushed back to the security office, heart racing, unsure if whoever was doing this was still in the building or already gone. When I got back, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a note on my desk, something that hadn't been there before. It simply said, "Nice to see you tonight." I called the police right away. They came and swept the building, but of course, they found nothing. The security footage was clear. No figure, no shadows, nothing that could explain what I'd seen. The building looked as empty and sterile as ever. They left, telling me to call again if anything else happened. But now, I couldn't relax. I sat at my desk, staring at the cameras, hyper-aware of every flicker of light, every small creak. I started questioning myself. Was I imagining this? But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone was still there, just out of sight. As my shift was ending, I glanced at the camera feed one last time. My heart stopped. I saw myself on the screen, staring back at me. But then, the figure on the screen moved before I did. I quit the next day. I couldn't stay there any longer. But even after leaving the job, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. I still find myself looking over my shoulder, listening for footsteps that shouldn't be there. Sometimes, late at night, I hear them again, those slow, deliberate footsteps. But now, I'm not sure if they're real or just in my head. The wrong Uber. I'm not usually the type to go out partying, but last Saturday was different. It had been a while since I'd seen my friends, so we decided to meet up in the city. You know, just a few drinks, catching up, nothing too wild. The night started out fun, laughing, talking about work and life, that kind of thing. By the time we were done, it was late, and I was just tipsy enough that I didn't feel like staying out any longer. I wasn't drunk, but I felt fuzzy around the edges. We said our goodbyes, and I pulled out my phone to order an Uber. My friends were heading in different directions, so I was alone on the curb, scrolling through my phone. The city was still alive, but quieter now, with just the hum of late-night traffic and the occasional shout of people still enjoying their night. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. The Uber had arrived. I checked the license plate, and it matched, so I got in without thinking much about it. The driver didn't say a word. No greeting, no confirmation of my destination. I thought maybe he was just tired or not in the mood to talk, and I didn't mind. The quiet was kind of nice after the noise of the bar, but there was something about the silence that felt too heavy. Still, I didn't want to make it a big deal. About 10 minutes into the ride, I started to feel uneasy. I've taken Ubers home before, and I know the general route we should have been taking, but none of this looked familiar. I kept waiting to see the usual landmarks, stores, restaurants, even street signs I knew, but they weren't there. The street seemed darker and emptier, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were going the wrong way. I opened the Uber app to check the route, and that's when I saw it. The little blue dot wasn't on the route it should have been. It was drifting further and further away from my destination. My first thought was maybe he was just avoiding traffic or taking a detour, but my gut told me otherwise. Something felt wrong. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Hey, I think you're going the wrong way," I said, not too confrontational but firm enough to get his attention. At first he didn't respond. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he muttered, "It's a shortcut," but his tone didn't reassure me. I could feel my heart racing. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it really was just a shortcut. But when I glanced at him, I noticed how tightly he was gripping the wheel. The air in the car felt thick, suffocating. I tried to calm down. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I checked my phone again, thinking I could cancel the ride, but the app wasn't responding. It was like it had frozen. I tapped the screen over and over, but nothing. My breathing started to quicken, and I realized I was now fully alert, scanning the streets as they passed by, none of them familiar, none of them comforting. The area outside was getting darker and more isolated. I asked again, a little louder this time, "Are you sure this is the right way?" His response came quicker, and it was harsher. "Just relax." That's when the panic really set in. He wasn't just ignoring me now, he was annoyed. I glanced down at the door locks. They were all down, and there didn't seem to be an unlock button on my side. I felt a wave of nausea. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I decided to fake a phone call. I started talking into my phone loudly, pretending I was checking in with a friend, saying things like, "Yeah, I'll be there in 5 minutes," and "You've got my location, right?" I wanted the driver to know that someone was waiting for me, but when I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, I saw something in his eyes that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't fear, it was frustration. He wasn't scared that I was onto him. He was irritated. The car slowed down at a red light, and for the first time in the ride, I felt a flicker of hope. The stillness gave me a chance to think. There was a gas station up ahead, just close enough that I might make it if I ran. My eyes darted to the lock again. My hand hovered near it, my mind screaming at me to act. Suddenly, the driver noticed. "What are you doing?" His voice was sharp, almost angry. He pressed something on his side of the door, and I heard a soft click as the doors all locked. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I felt cold all over. He looked back at me through the mirror, his expression unreadable, but his eyes cold, almost calculating. I didn't think, I just acted. As soon as the light turned green and the car started moving, I yanked at the lock, unlocked the door manually, and threw myself out of the car. The pavement hit me hard, pain shooting up my arm, but I forced myself to my feet and ran. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just sprinted toward the gas station as fast as my legs would carry me. I stumbled into the gas station, barely able to speak. The cashier stared at me, wide-eyed, as I gasped out, "I need help." I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. I could barely explain what happened, my words tumbling out in a rush. When the police arrived and took my statement, they asked for details, what kind of car, what the driver looked like, but I couldn't remember. Everything had blurred together in a haze of fear and adrenaline. That's when the officer checked my Uber app. "Your ride was still on the way," he said. "You got into the wrong car." It's been a few days now, but I can't shake the feeling. Every time I think about it, I see the driver's eyes in the mirror, the way he locked the doors, the sound of that click. The police told me they couldn't do much without more details, but how could I have noticed anything more? I was too busy trying to survive. I try to go back to my normal routine, but every time I walk to my car or call for another ride, I feel that cold dread creeping back in. Because I know one thing for sure, I almost didn't make it out. I've been running for years. It's my escape, a way to clear my head and keep in shape. Every morning, I lace up and head out to the forest trail near my house. I'm in my late 20s, so I'm still pretty fit, and that trail has always felt like home. I know every bend, every fallen tree, every dip in the path. It's quiet, peaceful. Most days, I'd be lucky to see another person out there. But lately, something's been off. For the past few weeks, I felt uneasy while running. At first, I thought it was just my anxiety acting up, maybe work stress or life stuff, but I kept hearing noises, like someone was behind me, but when I'd look back, there was nothing. I brushed it off as wildlife or the sound of my own feet hitting the dirt. Then, a few days ago, I caught a glimpse of someone, just for a second, way down the path, out of focus. Another runner, maybe. But it struck me as odd because this trail isn't popular. I shook it off, thinking it was just a random jogger like me. The next day, I decided to change my routine. I figured maybe running earlier would help shake off the weird feeling. So I went out before sunrise, hoping the darkness would help me reset. And that's when I saw him again. This time, he was closer, maybe 30 feet behind me. He was wearing a hooded sweatshirt, which seemed strange because it wasn't that cold. The hood was pulled low, so I couldn't see his face. I kept running, expecting him to either pass me or fall behind, but he didn't. He stayed at the same distance no matter how fast or slow I went. It was like he was matching my pace, but not engaging, not making eye contact. Just there. I started feeling paranoid, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he just liked the same trail. Still, I couldn't help glancing back every few minutes, and he was always there. One morning, I stopped to tie my shoe, figuring he'd run past me. When I looked up, the trail was empty. He was gone. I didn't hear him leave, didn't see any other paths he could have taken. That's when the fear really started to sink in. The next few runs were torture. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. No matter what time I went, no matter how fast I ran, the hooded runner was always there, keeping his distance but never leaving. His footsteps echoed mine, perfectly in sync. He never spoke, never even seemed to acknowledge my existence. It was like he was studying me, waiting for something. I tried to switch things up, started running through a more populated park instead of the forest. For a few days, I didn't see him, and I thought maybe I was free of whatever this was. But then, on a run through the park, I saw him again. This time, he wasn't running. He was sitting on a bench, just staring at me as I jogged by. He didn't follow that time, but I swear it felt like he knew I'd be there. After that, I couldn't take it anymore. I started changing my schedule at random, running at different times, skipping days, but he always found me. It was like no matter what I did, he was there. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, hearing his footsteps in my head. I stopped sleeping properly, too afraid that he was outside watching. One morning, as I was leaving for work, I saw him standing across the street from my house. He didn't move, didn't even look directly at me, but I knew he was watching. That was it. I couldn't ignore this anymore. The next time I saw him, I decided to confront him. I had to. I needed answers, and I needed to end this nightmare. On my next run, he showed up again, keeping his usual distance. I stopped dead in my tracks and turned around, waiting for him to approach. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. He slowed down as he got closer but didn't stop. He came within a few feet of me, and for the first time, I saw his face. It was pale, almost expressionless. Nothing about him stood out. No scars, no strange features, except for his eyes. They were intense, like he could see right through me. He finally spoke. "You run every day, right?" His voice was soft, almost friendly, but the question chilled me. There was something off about the way he said it, like there was a hidden threat behind the words. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, frozen. He took a step closer, and I could feel his breath. "You can't outrun everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then, just as quickly as he'd appeared, he turned and jogged away, disappearing into the woods. I stood there for what felt like forever, paralyzed by fear. His words kept ringing in my head. I felt like prey, like I was being hunted, and he was toying with me. When I finally made it home, I found a note tucked under my doormat. It was simple, just 3 words: "See you tomorrow." I haven't run since that day, but it hasn't stopped. I can still feel him watching me, even though I haven't seen him in weeks. I've noticed small things, scratches on my car, shadows moving just out of view when I'm walking my dog. I've isolated myself. My friends don't understand why I've stopped running, why I don't leave my house anymore. But I know. One evening, while I was watching TV, there was a knock at my door. I froze, heart racing. I waited, hoping it was nothing. When I finally checked the peephole, no one was there. But I know he's watching. I've thought about moving, but deep down, I know it won't matter. He'll find me wherever I go. I don't know when I'll see him again, but I know I will. I can't outrun him forever. The wallet, I don't usually post things like this, but something happened a few weeks ago, and I can't shake it. Maybe getting it out here will help. My life isn't all that interesting. I've got a regular 9 to 5, and I walk the same route to work and back every day. It's a quiet neighborhood, and I've never felt unsafe. But recently, I started noticing things that made me uneasy. There was this guy who stood outside my building for what felt like way too long. I kept seeing the same car pass by when I was walking. Stuff you'd normally shrug off, but it started to add up in the back of my mind. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that nothing had actually happened. But then I found the wallet. It was just lying there on the sidewalk during my usual walk home. It looked expensive, something that definitely belonged to someone who would want it back. I picked it up, figuring I'd return it to whoever lost it. Inside was a driver's license, a couple of credit cards, and a small slip of paper with a phone number. Nothing about it seemed off, just a lost wallet. But something felt strange as I held it. I brushed it off and texted the number. The reply came almost instantly, which surprised me. The person on the other end thanked me and asked if I could meet them at a cafe nearby to return the wallet. They even offered a reward. It seemed like the right thing to do, so I agreed. I didn't think too much about how fast they responded, though it was in the back of my mind. On my way to the cafe, I started feeling uneasy. Maybe it was because of everything that had been happening lately. People on the street seemed to give me strange looks, though I knew I was probably imagining it. Still, the feeling of being watched crept up on me, and I couldn't shake it. When I got to the cafe, it was weirdly empty. For a place that's usually pretty busy, the silence made it feel off. I sat down at one of the tables, gripping the wallet, and waited. Minutes passed. No one came. I kept looking at the door, expecting someone to walk in any second, but it was just me and the empty chairs. I checked my phone. There was another message. "Are you here?" it said, followed by a detailed description of the cafe, details I hadn't shared. It hit me then that someone was watching me. I scanned the room, but nothing looked out of place, which made it worse. The empty cafe, the silence, it all pressed in on me. I texted back asking where they were. The response? "I'm already here. You'll see me soon." My heart started pounding. I stared at my phone, then around the room again, trying to figure out what to do. I wanted to leave, but I had the wallet. It felt wrong to just walk away, even though my instincts were screaming at me to go. Then, I noticed a group sitting quietly at the back of the cafe. They hadn't been there when I walked in, or at least I hadn't noticed them. One of the men was glancing at me, almost casually, but something about the way he looked at me made me feel trapped. I decided to leave. As soon as I stood up, the group rose from their seats. It wasn't an obvious chase, but their movements mirrored mine. They weren't in a hurry, but they were definitely following me. I tried to act calm, walked out of the cafe as normally as I could, but inside, I was panicking. Outside, I picked up the pace, walking quickly down the street. My heart was racing, and when I glanced back, I saw them, just far enough away to not cause a scene, but close enough to know they were following. I called a friend, but it went straight to voicemail. No help there. I kept walking, thinking maybe I could lose them in a crowd, but every turn I took, they were still there, never overtaking me, just keeping pace. I felt like a mouse being toyed with. I passed an alley, and suddenly, one of the men stepped out, blocking my path. I froze. My mind was racing. Should I run, confront him, scream? But before I could do anything, the others closed in behind me. There was no way out. For what felt like an eternity, we just stood there, them surrounding me. Then one of the guys stepped forward, and in a calm, almost casual voice, he said, "Give us the wallet." I handed it over, thinking it would be enough. Maybe this was just some elaborate mugging, but they didn't leave. Instead, they demanded my phone, my wallet, everything. I gave it all up, hoping that would end it, but the fear in my gut told me this wasn't just about money. After what felt like forever, they finally walked away, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as they'd appeared. But even after they were gone, I couldn't move. The street was empty, but I felt like I was still being watched. Not by them, by someone else. I don't know how long I stood there before I finally made my way home, empty-handed and shaking. It's been weeks since it happened, and I can't stop thinking about it. I've been paranoid ever since. Every time I walk down that street, I feel like someone's watching me. I keep looking over my shoulder, expecting to see one of them, or worse, someone new. So, yeah. If you ever find something that feels a little off, trust your instincts. I still don't know if I was truly alone that night, or if someone's still out there, waiting for the right moment to come back. I started jogging at night about 2 months ago. It was right after a rough breakup and an especially stressful period at work. I needed some way to clear my head. I live in a quiet neighborhood, so it felt safe enough. The streets are usually empty, and the cool air is refreshing after hours spent cooped up at the office. At first, everything was great. The peacefulness of the night helped me unwind. The streets were lit just enough to see where I was going, but dark enough that I felt like I had the world to myself. That sense of solitude was what I needed. But after a couple of weeks, I started noticing a car parked along my route. It wasn't parked in a suspicious way or anything, just sitting there like any other car. I passed it night after night, and it always seemed to be in a slightly different spot. I told myself it was probably nothing, just someone's car. Maybe they parked in different spots to avoid street sweeping or something. But there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind. One night, as I was turning the corner, I saw the car's headlights flick on for a second before turning back off. It gave me this strange, uneasy feeling, like someone was watching me. I tried to shrug it off, thinking I was just being paranoid. One night, after a particularly hard day at work, I went for my usual run. I had a lot on my mind and just wanted to focus on my breathing, the rhythm of my footsteps. But when I reached the usual spot, there it was again. The same car. Only this time, it was parked a little closer to my route. I glanced at it, and for the first time, I saw someone inside. Their face wasn't clear, just an outline illuminated by the faint glow of a phone screen. My stomach twisted in a knot, and I instinctively sped up. As I neared the end of my usual loop, I heard the low growl of an engine behind me. My pulse quickened. I didn't look back. I didn't want to. I kept telling myself it was just someone going home, but the way the sound lingered behind me made my skin crawl. I cut my run short and hurried home. For the next few nights, I tried to ignore the feeling. I varied my routes and changed my jogging times, but no matter what I did, that car kept showing up, always in different places, always just there. I started wondering if I was overreacting. Was it really following me, or was I just imagining things? I didn't talk to anyone about it because I thought I'd sound ridiculous. After all, what was I going to say? Hey, there's a car that's parked near me sometimes. One night, I decided to shake it off completely. I changed my route entirely, choosing smaller side streets and alleyways. For a while, I felt like I was in control again. I hadn't seen the car, and I felt relief creeping back. But as I turned the corner onto a smaller, darker street, I saw it. The same car, parked at the end of the block. Its headlights were off, but I could hear the engine softly idling. My heart dropped. I stopped for a second, frozen in place, before I forced myself to keep moving. Was this real? Or was I letting stress and anxiety from everything else cloud my judgment? My breakup, my job, it was all piling up. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe it was all in my head. I stopped jogging for a few days, trying to let the tension ease. But at night, I still heard it. A faint car engine humming outside my apartment. When I looked out the window, there was nothing there. I couldn't sleep well. I kept dreaming about headlights, about being followed. After a few nights, I convinced myself I was overreacting. I was probably just paranoid, and I needed to get back to normal. So I decided to go for another jog. Everything seemed fine. I stuck to the well-lit streets, and for the first part of the run, there was no sign of the car. I started to feel lighter, like I had imagined the whole thing. But then, just as I was about to head home, I heard it again. The rumble of an engine. I glanced over my shoulder, and there it was. The car was creeping along the street behind me, headlights flickering on. My blood ran cold. Panic surged through me, and I took off running as fast as I could. My heart pounded in my chest, my legs burned, but the car kept its steady pace behind me, not speeding up, just staying close enough to be a threat. The street was empty, and I knew I couldn't keep running like that forever. I darted into a narrow alleyway between two houses, hoping to lose the car. As I raced through the alley, I heard the car stop. Its engine idled nearby, the sound vibrating through the silence. My lungs were on fire, but I kept going, climbing over a fence and collapsing into someone's backyard. I crouched behind a bush, my breath ragged and my ears straining to hear any sign of the car. Minutes passed. Then, slowly, I heard the engine fade as the car drove away. I stayed hidden for what felt like forever before finally making my way home. I haven't jogged at night since. Now I only run during the day, but the fear hasn't left me. Every time I see a car that looks remotely similar, my heart races. I find myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I'd like to admit. Even in my apartment, I don't feel completely safe. I've thought about going to the police, but what could I say? A car followed me a few times? It sounds crazy, even to me. But I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Even as I type this, I just heard a car drive past my apartment. Its engine lingered for a moment longer than usual before it finally moved on. I recently moved into a small apartment in what I thought was a quiet, peaceful neighborhood. It wasn't the fanciest place, but it felt cozy, and that's what I needed after years of living in chaotic cities. The building was old, The walls were thin, and you could hear creaks in the floors at night. But overall, it was charming, and the few tenants I saw around mostly kept to themselves. Except for Mark. Mark introduced himself to me on my first day, just as I was moving boxes inside. He seemed like a friendly, middle-aged guy. Too friendly, actually. He lived down the hall and said that if I ever needed anything, he was happy to help. I thought it was nice at first. A bit much, but maybe he was just trying to be neighborly. As he left, though, his smile lingered a little too long. It was the kind of smile that felt like it should have ended a second earlier. That first night, I heard footsteps outside my door. At first, I thought it was just someone passing by, but they stopped right in front of my apartment. I waited, tense, until they finally moved on. I told myself it was just the old building making noises. It had to be. Mark started showing up more often after that. It wasn't unusual to bump into neighbors, but he seemed to be around all the time. Sometimes he'd knock on my door, offering leftover food or asking how I was settling in. One night, he came by really late, just to check if I needed anything. I started to feel uneasy, but I didn't want to be rude. I figured he was just trying to be friendly. Then, one day, he mentioned he noticed I'd been out all day and wondered where I went. I hadn't told anyone my schedule, so how did he know? It creeped me out. I started locking my door all the time, even when I was just inside watching TV. I tried to keep our conversation short, but when I did, his smile seemed to fade for a second, like he didn't like the distance I was putting between us. But then, just as quickly, the smile would come back. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a soft tapping at my window. It didn't make sense. My apartment was on the second floor. There was no balcony or fire escape out there. I checked, but no one was there. That's when I started to really question what was happening. Mark's behavior escalated from there. One morning, I found him standing outside my door as I left for work. He said he was just passing by, but it was 6 a.m. Who just passes by at that hour? He asked more personal questions about my friends, my family, even my work hours. I noticed little things around my apartment that didn't seem right. The latch on the window seemed looser. A cupboard door was left open when I was sure I'd closed it. And one day, a jacket I'd left on a chair was crumpled on the floor. It felt like someone had been in my apartment. I started getting paranoid. I checked the locks on the door twice before bed, left the lights on, and even thought about breaking my lease and moving out. But I didn't have the money, and I wasn't sure if I was overreacting. I told a coworker about Mark, but I didn't know how to explain why it felt so off. He hadn't done anything explicitly wrong. It just felt wrong. My coworker suggested I talk to the landlord, but I didn't want to cause trouble. One night I was lying in bed when I heard it, the sound of a key turning in my front door lock. My heart raced. I rushed to the door, but it was still locked. There was no one there. I couldn't sleep that night, convinced that Mark was somehow getting into my apartment. The next day, I went to the landlord to ask about the building's security. That's when I found out something that made my blood run cold. Mark had asked for a spare key to my apartment right after I moved in. He told the landlord it was just in case I locked myself out, but I'd never asked for that. The landlord didn't think much of it because Mark had been living there for years and seemed trustworthy. I decided that night to bolt my door with every lock I had. I didn't sleep much, thinking about how I'd confront Mark the next day. But I didn't get the chance. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of my door opening. I froze. Standing in my apartment, just a few feet away from my bed, was Mark, holding a spare key in his hand. His face wasn't angry. It was confused, almost hurt. "I thought we were friends," he said quietly. He stepped closer. "You've been avoiding me. I don't understand why." I fumbled for my phone, ready to call the police, but Mark raised his hand, his voice soft. "You don't need to call anyone. I just want to talk. We can fix this." Before I knew what I was doing, I jumped out of bed, ran past him, and banged on my neighbor's door. I woke the whole building. Mark didn't follow me, but he stood there, watching from the doorway of my apartment, still holding the key. The police came, and Mark was questioned. He told them he thought we were becoming friends and that he didn't mean any harm. The landlord confirmed his story about the spare key, so legally, Mark hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't broken in, and he hadn't threatened me. But I felt violated. Mark returned to his apartment, and the police left. For a moment, there was some relief, knowing the authorities had been involved, but I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. Within a week, I packed up and moved out. I haven't seen Mark since, but I still don't feel safe. Every time I hear a knock on the door or a creak in the floorboards, my heart races. I keep thinking about the last thing he said to me before I left. "I'll miss you." Even now, in my new place, I feel like I'm being watched. I just hope I don't hear a key turning in my new door. I don't usually post here, but something happened to me recently, and I can't stop thinking about it. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear it's true. I'm still trying to make sense of it myself. I don't know what to do with this fear that's been eating at me, so I guess I'll just tell the story here and see if anyone can help me understand. A couple of weeks ago, I was driving home late at night after a long business trip. I'd been on the road for hours and was exhausted. My life's been pretty stressful lately. Work deadlines, fights with my girlfriend, it's all been piling up. I took this back road to avoid traffic, a quiet stretch of highway that cuts through some pretty rural areas. The kind of road where you don't see many cars for miles, which was fine with me at first. The silence helped me think, but after a while, the isolation started to feel eerie. The radio cut out, so I drove in silence. The dashboard lights flickered every now and then, and once or twice, I thought I heard a strange noise from the back seat, but I chalked it up to exhaustion. Still, something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone, even though there wasn't a car in sight. Then, up ahead, I saw a figure by the side of the road. A hitchhiker, standing under a flickering streetlight. I remember thinking how weird it was to see someone out here in the middle of nowhere. It was late, and he looked kind of desperate. He was waving me down. I hesitated. Everything in me said to keep driving, but it was cold, and he looked harmless enough. I didn't want to leave him stranded. So, against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over. I opened the passenger door, and he climbed in without a word. He just sat there, staring straight ahead. He was a rough-looking guy, disheveled clothes, scruffy beard. I asked him where he was heading, but he didn't really answer. Instead, he started talking about the road, about how dark it was, how lonely it must be to drive it often. His voice was flat, emotionless. I didn't know what to say, so I kept quiet, just hoping to drop him off somewhere soon. Then, out of nowhere, he said something that made my stomach drop. "I bet your girlfriend doesn't like when you take these late drives." I glanced at him. I hadn't mentioned anything about my personal life. My pulse quickened, but I tried to stay calm. Maybe he was just making a guess. Still, I felt a knot forming in my chest. I forced a laugh and said something like, "Yeah, she worries sometimes." But the hitchhiker wasn't smiling. He just kept staring out the windshield, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the door. The atmosphere in the car shifted. I could feel the tension building, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. Every mile felt longer than the last. He kept talking, but his comments were getting more specific. Too specific. He mentioned the name of my boss, the exact layout of my office building. I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck. How did he know? I tried to play it cool, asking him vague questions to test if maybe he was just making weird guesses. But each answer he gave hit closer to home. He knew about my fights with my girlfriend, my weekend plans, even my apartment's location. My mind was racing. Was this guy following me? Had he been stalking me for days, weeks? My throat felt tight, and I couldn't think straight. I was too afraid to confront him, though. What if he got violent? My phone was dead, and we were in the middle of nowhere. Every second in that car was suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't some coincidence. Then, casually, like he was talking about the weather, the hitchhiker said, "There's a gas station up ahead. We should stop. I could use a stretch." My heart sank. I hadn't told him where I was going, but he knew there was a gas station nearby. I hadn't seen a sign, and I'd driven this route only once before. I didn't remember a station. How did he? I pulled into the gas station a few minutes later, a small, dimly lit place. It was the only building for miles, and the parking lot was empty. The hitchhiker got out of the car slowly, stretching his legs, but I stayed inside, gripping the wheel. I thought about leaving him there and driving off, but when I looked in the rearview mirror, he was staring right at me. It was like he knew what I was thinking. He circled the car, tapping his fingers on the windows as he walked by. "It's funny," he said, stopping by my window. "You remind me a lot of myself, back when I had my own place. You still live on Oak Street, right?" My blood turned to ice. That was my street. He wasn't guessing anymore. He knew exactly where I lived. I wanted to scream at him, to demand how he knew all of this, but I was frozen. I couldn't move, couldn't think straight. He just smiled, a slow, cold smile that made my skin crawl. Then, without another word, he turned and walked off into the dark, disappearing into the trees behind the station. For a few seconds, I just sat there, stunned, unsure if I should follow him or drive away. But the fear was overwhelming. I slammed the car into drive and peeled out of the lot, heart pounding, eyes darting to every shadow on the road. The whole drive home, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, convinced he was following me. Every car that appeared in the distance, every flicker of light, made me jump. My mind raced. Had he been following me for days? Weeks? Was this all planned? By the time I got home, I was shaking. I pulled into my driveway and just sat there, staring into the dark. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing under the streetlight down the road, watching. I couldn't see his face, but I knew it was him. I bolted inside, locked every door, every window. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching, waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I hear a soft knock at the door and my heart stops. I don't answer. I can't. Because I know that if I do, it'll be him. I never thought I'd be one of those moms who loses sleep over every little noise, but here I am. My daughter, Emily, is only a few months old, and I feel like I haven't slept a full night since she was born. My husband works long hours, so most nights it's just me and Emily alone in the house. I got a baby monitor to keep an eye on her while I'm in the other room. It has a camera that streams to my phone so I can check in on her from anywhere in the house. It gives me a little peace of mind. At least, it did at first. Lately, though, I've been hearing things at night. It's nothing big, just little creaks and faint sounds. At first, I chalked it up to the house settling, or maybe my imagination, since I've been so sleep-deprived. But there's this nagging feeling I can't shake, like something's just a bit off. Last night, something strange happened. I was dozing off when I heard a soft cry through the baby monitor. It was so quiet, I almost didn't notice it. But when I looked at the monitor, Emily was perfectly still, sleeping peacefully in her crib. I thought maybe I was hearing things, but I got up to check on her anyway. She was fine. The crying stuck with me, though. I couldn't get it out of my head. The next night, the same thing happened. Soft crying, Emily perfectly still. I checked the nursery again, and she was sound asleep, just like before. I told myself it was just my tired brain playing tricks, but after a few nights of this, I started to feel uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A few nights later, I was lying in bed when I heard the crying again. Only this time, there was something else. A voice, faint and muffled, like it was coming from the monitor. I froze. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone to check the camera. Emily was sleeping, but in the corner of the screen, I saw a dark shape. I stared at it, trying to figure out what it was, but it didn't move. My first instinct was to rush into the nursery, but I hesitated. What if it was nothing? What if I was losing my mind? I stayed glued to the monitor, waiting for the shape to move, but it stayed perfectly still. I couldn't tear my eyes away. For the next few nights, I barely slept. I couldn't stop watching the monitor. The dark shape in the corner haunted me. Every time I checked, it was there, unmoving. I tried to tell myself it was just a shadow, maybe a toy or something. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. My nerves were shot, and I started checking the monitor every few minutes, afraid I'd miss something. One night, the shape seemed to move. I wasn't sure if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but I panicked. I called my husband, but he brushed it off, telling me I needed to rest. "It's probably just a shadow," he said. "You're exhausted." He didn't get it. I felt completely alone, trapped in this endless cycle of fear and exhaustion. I started going through the monitor's recordings, fast-forwarding through hours of footage, trying to find something, anything, that would explain what I was seeing. But there was nothing. No movement, no sounds. Just Emily sleeping soundly. I was starting to question my sanity. The crying didn't stop, though. It would come at random times, catching me off guard. Each time the monitor showed Emily sleeping, and each time I felt more and more like I was losing control. I thought about taking Emily to my parents' house for a few days, just to get away from the monitor, the shadows, the crying. But something stopped me. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was pride. I didn't want to admit that something was wrong. On the 7th night, I was sitting in the living room, staring at the monitor again. The crying started up, soft and distant. My eyes were locked on the screen, and that dark shape was there, in the corner, just like before. Only this time, it moved. Slowly, but unmistakably, it shifted. I didn't think. I jumped up, raced down the hall, and threw open the nursery door. My hands were shaking as I reached for the light switch. When the room lit up, my heart was pounding in my chest. Emily was sound asleep, just like always. The room was silent except for my ragged breathing. In a panic, I grabbed a stuffed animal off the floor and threw it across the room. I was so sure something was hiding in the shadows. But when I looked again, I saw it. The dark shape I'd been obsessing over for days. It wasn't some sinister figure. It was just the stuffed animal, casting a shadow in the corner, thanks to the poorly positioned nightlight. I stood there, staring at the corner, feeling like a complete fool. The crying, the shadows, it had all been in my head. Exhaustion, isolation, and constant anxiety had played tricks on me. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I couldn't stop thinking about how my mind had betrayed me. The next day, I rearranged the nursery, moved the nightlight, and tried to convince myself that everything was fine. But the unease didn't go away. I kept looking at the baby monitor, feeling a chill every time I glanced at the screen. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I looked at the monitor one last time. Emily was sleeping peacefully, and the room was quiet. But just as I was about to turn off the light, I heard it again. Faint, almost imperceptible, Emily's soft cry. And this time I wasn't sure if I could trust what I was hearing. I've always been careful on the road, especially when driving home after my late shifts. I work at a small clinic, and by the time I finish, the highway is usually empty. I live in a rural area, so it's mostly long, dark roads with hardly any cars at night. The quiet has always been something I enjoyed. It gave me time to think. That night, though, something felt different. I was halfway home, listening to some soft rock on the radio, when I noticed a car behind me. I wouldn't have paid much attention to it, but it had been trailing me for a while. Not too close, but it wasn't passing me either. It just stayed there, matching my speed, which felt odd for this time of night. I brushed it off. Paranoia, I told myself. I've driven this route hundreds of times without incident, but my mind wouldn't let it go. I glanced in my rearview mirror again, and that's when I saw the flashing lights. A police car was signaling me to pull over. At first, I wasn't too concerned. I thought maybe I was speeding without realizing it, but something about those lights felt wrong. They were there, but dim, and the car wasn't the usual type I saw patrolling. Still, I did as I was supposed to and pulled over to the side of the road. The officer got out, walking towards me slowly, shining his flashlight right into my face, which made me squint. I could barely see him. His uniform looked fine, but the way he carried himself, it wasn't right. He wasn't in a rush, more like he was taking his time, enjoying the moment. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his voice calm but too casual for the situation. Home," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is everything okay?" "Are you alone?" He leaned in closer to my window, the light still shining in my eyes. That question set off alarms in my head. It didn't sound like something a cop should be asking. My heart started pounding, and my hands trembled as I reached for my glove box to grab my license and registration. But he didn't ask for them. Instead, he stood there, watching me. Something was wrong. Really wrong. I felt trapped under his stare. It wasn't just the question, it was how he said it, like he already knew the answer and was toying with me. I managed to mumble something about being tired, trying to sound casual, but my voice cracked. I was scared, and he could tell. "Step out of the car," he said, his tone a bit firmer now. "I need to check something with your taillight." I didn't move. Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, to not open that door. I glanced in my side mirror, and that's when I saw it. His car wasn't a real police car. There were no markings, just a couple of flashing lights rigged to the top of an old, beat-up model. My stomach dropped. "I'd rather stay inside. It's cold," I stammered, trying to sound polite, but I knew I was losing control of my voice. The fear was leaking out. He didn't respond right away, just stared at me through the window. Then, he tapped the glass, slow and deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. His smile was gone, replaced by something colder, something I can only describe as predatory. I locked the doors, hoping he didn't notice. My mind raced for an excuse, something to get me out of this situation, but all I could think about was how isolated I was. The road was empty. No cars had passed in what felt like hours. I was completely alone with him. "I'm gonna need you to step out," he repeated, his voice harder now. No, I thought to myself, I couldn't do it. I wouldn't. Suddenly, without thinking, I jammed the keys into the ignition and started the car. His expression changed instantly. I didn't wait for him to react. I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding away as fast as I could. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, my blood ran cold. He was following me. He had jumped back into his car, and those dim flashing lights were back on, closing the distance between us. I pushed the gas pedal harder, trying to stay in control of the car as the narrow road seemed to stretch on forever. The darkness around me felt suffocating, the empty fields on either side offering no escape. His headlights glared into my mirror, and I knew he was right behind me, tailgating so closely that I couldn't even see the front of his car. I wanted to reach for my phone in my bag, but I couldn't afford to take my hands off the wheel. I was driving at breakneck speed now, and one wrong move could send me off the road. Suddenly, a car appeared in the distance, heading in the opposite direction. For a split second, I considered flashing my lights, swerving, anything to get their attention. But the moment passed too quickly, and I didn't dare risk losing control. The man behind me wasn't giving up. His car surged forward, getting closer and closer. I spotted an exit coming up and veered onto it, hoping to lose him on the smaller, unfamiliar road. But as I turned, I saw his car make the same turn, right on my tail. The road was even darker now, narrower. My breath was ragged as I tried to think of a way out. Up ahead, I saw a gas station, but it was closed, the lights off. I debated stopping, but I knew I was still too vulnerable. His headlights were still behind me. And then, without warning, he switched off his flashing lights. He was done pretending. My mind was racing. There was no one to help me, no way to escape. I couldn't see any other cars. I couldn't stop. I couldn't outrun him. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was being hunted. I drove faster, pushing the car to its limits, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My phone buzzed in my bag, but there was no way to reach it. I was on my own. In the rearview mirror, his car was still there, close behind, keeping pace. He wasn't going anywhere, and neither was I. The key under the mat. I don't know why I'm posting this here. Maybe I just need someone to listen, to know that I'm not crazy. My name's Sarah, and I've always considered myself pretty normal. I live alone in a small suburban neighborhood, one of those quiet places where everyone minds their own business. I keep things simple. I go to work, come home, make dinner, and unwind. The kind of routine that feels safe, predictable. A while ago, I started keeping a spare key under my doormat just in case. I know. Everyone says it's a bad idea, but I figured no one would ever bother looking for it. My neighborhood feels safe, and I'm usually careful. Everything was fine for the longest time. But recently, things have been off. It started small. I'd come home and feel like something was different, though I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe the air felt colder or the silence too heavy, but I brushed it off. Nothing was obviously wrong, and I'm not the type to jump to conclusions. That was until one night when I was getting ready for bed. I checked under the mat out of habit. The key was gone. At first, I thought I must have misplaced it. Maybe I used it and forgot to put it back. But that nagging feeling told me otherwise. I tried not to think about it, but over the next few days, more things started to bother me. I'd leave for work in the morning, positive that I locked the door, only to come back and find it unlocked. Other times, I'd notice little things out of place. A kitchen chair slightly pulled out, a window cracked open when I knew I hadn't touched it. I kept telling myself it was just me being paranoid. I was probably tired, distracted. But then, my neighbor mentioned seeing a strange man hanging around my front yard while I was at work. She said he was just standing there, looking at my house. That made my stomach drop. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. Then came the call. One of my coworkers asked why I hadn't said hi that morning when they saw me leaving the house. The problem was, I hadn't left the house that day. I'd taken the day off and hadn't even gone outside. My blood ran cold. That night, I searched every corner of my house, checking every lock, every room. I didn't find anything out of the ordinary, but the unease wouldn't go away. I couldn't sleep without a knife under my pillow. I started keeping my phone next to me at all times, checking the doors and windows obsessively. A few nights later, I came home to something that made my heart stop. Muddy footprints led from my front door to my living room. They were fresh. Someone had been inside while I was at work. I called a locksmith the next morning and had the locks changed immediately. I thought that would be the end of it. But no matter how many times I checked the doors, no matter how much I tried to reassure myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. I bought a security camera and installed it by the front door. That helped a little, but the paranoia stayed. I didn't trust the locks. I didn't trust anything. One night, I decided to check the camera footage before bed. I sat there, watching the feed from earlier in the day, fast-forwarding through the footage. And then, the screen went black for a few minutes. When it came back on, everything looked normal again, but I had no idea what had happened during that blackout. I barely slept that night. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard it again. Slow, deliberate footsteps inside the house. My heart was pounding. I stayed perfectly still, holding my breath, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, I mustered the courage to check. The back door was wide open. I didn't know what to do. I was losing my mind. I had been so careful, changed the locks, set up cameras, and yet, someone had been inside again. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That I heard footsteps in the middle of the night? That someone had opened a door but left no trace? They wouldn't take me seriously. Then, one evening, I came home earlier than usual. I unlocked the front door and immediately heard movement inside. I froze. My heart raced so fast I thought I might pass out. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and slowly made my way to the living room. And there he was, a man, standing in the dark, facing away from me. I couldn't see his face, but he was tall, his clothes dirty, and he wasn't moving. I didn't think. I just backed away as quietly as I could, ran to the bathroom, and locked the door. I called the police, whispering into the phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably. They came quickly. When they searched the house, they found no one. No sign of forced entry. No muddy footprints. They told me it might have been a hallucination, stress from lack of sleep. But I knew what I saw. I wasn't imagining things. As the officers left, I noticed something under the new doormat. A folded piece of paper. It simply said, "I know you're alone." I changed the locks again. This time I added deadbolts and extra cameras around the house. But none of it helped. I quit my job because I couldn't leave the house anymore. The thought of someone having free access to my life for who knows how long. It broke me. Even now, I don't feel safe. I keep looking over my shoulder, flinching at every creak, every gust of wind. I stare at the camera feeds for hours, watching, waiting. Sometimes, the cameras glitch for just a second, and I wonder if it's happening all over again. I'm still here in the same house, but it doesn't feel like mine anymore. And the worst part is, I'll never know if or when they'll come back. I want to share something that happened to me last year. Even now, I still don't feel completely safe, and I guess I'm posting this because I want to know if anyone else has gone through something similar. It started out pretty innocently, but things escalated fast, and I've never looked at my life the same way since. I live alone in a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. I work a normal 9-to-5 office job, and my life is pretty routine. After work, I often stop by the convenience store a block away to grab snacks or things I forgot to buy during my regular grocery runs. The store isn't anything special, but it's convenient. That's where I first met him. Let's call him Dave. Dave worked at the register. He was always cheerful, smiling every time I came in. At first, I didn't think much of it. It's not unusual for a cashier to be friendly with regular customers. Over time, though, Dave started asking more personal questions. He'd ask about my job, my weekend plans, even how long I'd lived in the area. It felt like harmless small talk at first, just something to pass the time while he scanned my items. I'm an introvert, so these small interactions were kind of nice in a way. But soon, it started to feel a little off. It seemed like no matter when I went into the store, early morning, late evening, even midday, Dave was always there. At first, I thought it was just coincidence. Maybe he worked a lot of shifts, but after a while, it started to feel like he was always there. I brushed it off, thinking I was overthinking things. Then something happened that made it harder to ignore. One day, I was leaving the office on my lunch break when I saw Dave standing across the street. He was smoking a cigarette, and when he saw me, he waved. I froze for a second, feeling unsettled, but then I convinced myself it had to be a coincidence. Maybe he worked another job nearby? Maybe he was just in the area for some reason. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. But the next day, I saw him again. This time, he wasn't smoking. He was just standing there, watching the building. I didn't wave back, just kept walking, but the pit in my stomach was growing. I started thinking about all those questions he'd asked me at the store. How much did he know about my routine, my life? I tried telling myself I was overreacting, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. This wasn't just a coincidence. A few days later, one of my coworkers mentioned seeing a man lingering outside the office after hours. When she described him, my heart sank. It was Dave. That was the moment I realized I wasn't imagining things. He was following me. The fear set in, and I started avoiding the convenience store altogether, hoping that would solve the problem. But it didn't. I still felt like I was being watched. Every time I left the office or walked home, I was hyper aware of my surroundings, always glancing over my shoulder. One night, I stayed late at work to finish a project, and by the time I left, the streets were mostly empty. I was about halfway home when I heard footsteps behind me. I glanced back and saw Dave. He wasn't running or hiding. He was just walking a few paces behind me, calm and deliberate. My heart raced. I sped up, practically running by the time I reached my building. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. My mind was racing. I didn't know what to do. The next morning, I went to the police. They told me that unless he made an explicit threat or did something more, there wasn't much they could do. I felt helpless. I even thought about telling my boss at work, but what was I going to say? That the friendly cashier at the convenience store was following me? It sounded crazy, but I knew what I felt. Then one night, just as I was starting to relax a bit, I heard a knock at my door. It was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole. No one was there. But when I glanced down, there was something lying on the floor in front of the door. It was a receipt from the convenience store. On it, in handwriting I recognized, was my full name. My heart dropped. I hadn't been to that store in weeks. The next day, I decided to confront him. I went to the store after work, and sure enough, Dave was there, smiling like always. My voice shook as I asked him why he'd been following me, why he was outside my office, why he left that receipt at my door. But Dave didn't miss a beat. He just smiled and said I must be confused, that he had no idea what I was talking about. His calmness made my skin crawl. He denied everything, making me feel like I was the one losing it. I left the store feeling worse than ever. That night, I came home late again, checking all the locks twice. Then I heard it. The knocking. This time, it didn't stop. I looked through the peephole, and there he was, standing just inches from my door, smiling that same smile. My hand shook as I reached for my phone, but the battery was dead. My mind raced, and before I could think, I cracked the door open to yell at him to leave. That's when he shoved the door open. I don't remember much after that. My neighbor must have heard the commotion and called the police. They arrived just in time. Dave was arrested, but before they took him away, he told me in this calm, creepy voice that he'd been watching me for months, not just at the store, but everywhere. I later found out from the police that this wasn't the first time. He had a history of stalking, with restraining orders from other women. Even though he's gone, I don't feel safe. Every time I walk down the street, I catch glimpses of people who look like him. I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. Maybe I'm just paranoid now, or maybe I'll never know if he was working alone. The Handyman. I bought my first home about 6 months ago. It's a small, older house in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but it's mine, and I was proud of it. Moving in, there were some things that needed fixing: creaky doors, a faucet that wouldn't stop dripping, stuff like that. Since I'm no good with tools, I decided to hire a handyman. A neighbor recommended Carl. He was in his 50s, weathered looking, and didn't talk much, but he got the work done. Carl fixed everything up over a few visits. At first, I didn't think anything of it. He seemed professional, just another guy doing his job. But after he finished, things started to feel off. I'd come home from work and noticed the back door was unlocked. I always lock the doors before I leave, so it didn't make sense. One day, I found some tools in a drawer in the kitchen. Carl's tools. I didn't remember him leaving them there, but I figured he just forgot. I brushed it off, but the idea that someone had been inside while I was gone started to gnaw at me. Then one night, I came home late and saw something strange. From the corner of my eye, I noticed a figure standing in the yard, just beyond the window. I froze, staring through the curtains, but when I looked again, the figure was gone. My heart was pounding. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was my imagination. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. A few days later, something else happened. I found a hammer in my bedroom, tucked behind the dresser. Carl had used that hammer, but I was sure he never went into my bedroom while he was working. Why would he? The repairs he did were in the kitchen and the bathroom. I felt a chill run down my spine. It didn't make sense. I told myself it was a mistake, but that sinking feeling wouldn't go away. I decided to call Carl and ask him about it. He laughed when I mentioned the hammer, saying he probably left it by mistake. His laugh was off. It didn't feel right. It was too casual, like he didn't care. That night, I made sure to lock every window and door, checking twice. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in my house. A week later, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and coming from the hallway. My heart raced. I grabbed my phone, too scared to move. I listened, but the footsteps stopped. I stayed in bed, frozen, until dawn. That morning, I decided enough was enough. I called a security company to install cameras and new locks. When the technician came, he pointed out something disturbing. Someone had tampered with my back door lock. I didn't know who, but I couldn't stop thinking about Carl. He had been in and out of my house. Could he have copied my keys? That night, I got a text from an unknown number. It was a picture of my house, taken from across the street. The message read, "Nice house." My stomach dropped. I called the police, but they said without a break-in or a clear threat, there wasn't much they could do. They told me to be careful and keep everything locked up. That didn't make me feel any safer. I started carrying a knife with me around the house. Every creak, every little noise made me jump. I felt like I was losing my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about Carl, how he knew my house, had been inside, and might still have access. That thought kept me up at night. One night I heard the footsteps again. This time, they weren't just in the hallway. They were in my bedroom. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. In the dim light, I saw him. Carl. He was standing at the foot of my bed, holding a flashlight. "I was just checking the repairs," he said, his voice calm. I scrambled for the knife I kept under my pillow. My hand shook as I demanded to know how he got inside. Carl didn't answer. He just smiled. A cold, unnerving smile. It was then I realized he had been watching me for weeks, using his knowledge of the house to invade my space. I jumped out of bed, knife in hand, and screamed at him to leave. Carl's face changed. His smile faded and his eyes darkened. "You're overreacting," he said quietly. "I just wanted to check up on things." I didn't care. Fear and adrenaline kicked in, and I lunged toward him, forcing him back out of the room. He didn't resist, just stepped back, his eyes never leaving mine. I slammed the door and barricaded it, calling 911 as my hands shook uncontrollably. When the police arrived, Carl was long gone. There was no sign of forced entry, and without that, they couldn't arrest him. They took a report, but that was all. They suggested I stay with a friend for the night, so I packed a bag and left. The next morning, I returned to find a note on my doorstep. It simply said, "I'll see you again." I don't know what to do. I've installed even more locks and cameras, but I still don't feel safe. Every time I leave the house, I think about him coming back. I see him everywhere, at the grocery store, parked down the street, in my nightmares. I've moved to a new apartment now, but the feeling hasn't gone away. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder. Has anyone else had an experience like this? What should I do? I keep hoping Carl will move on, but I can't shake the feeling that he's not done with me yet. The figure in the parking lot, I've never been one to scare easily. I work long shifts in IT, and coming home late at night is just part of the job. I live alone in a small apartment complex. Nothing fancy, but it's affordable, and I'm used to the place. The only thing that's ever bothered me about it is the parking lot. It's not terrible, but it's mostly empty at night, and the lighting is awful. The street lamps are either too dim or flicker like they're about to go out. Sometimes I hear strange noises out there, like a car door shutting or rustling, but I always tell myself it's just the wind or maybe a stray cat. That night wasn't any different. I just finished a long shift and was exhausted. All I wanted was to get to my apartment, throw my stuff down, and crash. The parking lot was nearly empty, as usual. A couple of cars that I never see anyone drive were still parked in the same spots. I locked my car and began walking towards my building. The air was unusually still, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, though I couldn't pinpoint what. About halfway across the lot, I noticed a car parked in the far corner, a beat-up sedan I hadn't seen before. Its engine was off, but there was a faint glow from inside. A figure sat in the driver's seat, barely visible. I stopped for a second, squinting to get a better look. It was too dark to see the person's face, but I could tell they were staring straight ahead. Probably someone waiting for a friend, I thought, but a weird tension crept up my spine. I tried to shake off the unease as I continued walking. It was probably nothing, just some tired guy waiting in his car. Still, I felt their eyes on me the entire time. My pace quickened, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. The figure hadn't moved. By the time I reached the stairs leading up to my building, I could feel my hands shaking slightly. I tried to laugh it off. There was no reason to be freaked out. I reached into my pocket for my keys as I stepped onto the first stair. The parking lot was eerily quiet. No cars passing by, no footsteps, just me and the distant hum of electricity in the air. That's when I heard it. A soft click echoed behind me. I turned just in time to see the car door swing open. The figure stepped out slowly, almost like they were taking their time. I couldn't see much in the dim light, but they were tall, with broad shoulders. I couldn't make out their face, but I knew, without a doubt, that they were looking directly at me. My mind started racing. Was this some neighbor I hadn't met, a random person? I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the deliberate way they moved felt wrong. I forced myself to turn around and start walking up the stairs, trying to act casual. No need to panic yet. But the crunch of gravel behind me made my heart pound. They were following me. My breathing became shallow. Each step felt heavier as I climbed the stairs. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? Someone's walking behind me? I didn't want to overreact, but the footsteps behind me were speeding up. Whoever it was, they were closing the distance. I cursed under my breath for living on the third floor. I took the stairs two at a time, trying not to look over my shoulder, but the footsteps were louder now, almost matching my pace. My apartment was in sight, and I reached for my keys again, but that's when it hit me. I'd left them in the car. Panic shot through me like electricity. I fumbled for my phone, my mind scrambling for an exit strategy. I could hear the footsteps getting closer. My heart was in my throat, and I glanced back down the stairs. The figure was already halfway up. My phone slipped out of my hand and clattered to the floor. I was out of time. I snatched it up, but I knew there wasn't enough time to call anyone. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just a neighbor. Maybe they were heading to their apartment. But when I looked down again, the way they moved, it was too deliberate, too focused. This person wasn't lost or confused. They were following me. I considered running back down the stairs, but I knew they'd catch me. My hands were trembling as I tried to remember if I'd left my door unlocked. I hadn't. The footsteps echoed in the narrow stairwell, each step heavier than the last. My pulse was racing as I pressed my back against the door, trying to stay calm, but every nerve in my body was screaming to run. The figure reached the base of the final flight of stairs and paused. I still couldn't see their face clearly, but I could feel their eyes on me. For a moment, neither of us moved. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced with scenarios, none of them good. And then, just as suddenly as they'd stopped, the figure turned. Slowly, they walked back down the stairs, their footsteps soft but deliberate. I stayed frozen, watching as they reached the bottom, walked back across the lot, and got into their car. The engine started, and the car drove away, disappearing into the night. I didn't move until the sound of the engine faded completely. My legs were weak as I finally unlocked my door and stumbled inside. I locked it behind me, heart pounding, drenched in sweat. I collapsed on the floor, my head spinning. What just happened? Was I really in danger, or had I overreacted? I couldn't be sure. All I knew was that I hadn't felt fear like that in my life. I checked the window. Nothing. The parking lot was empty again. It's been days now, but I can't shake the feeling. Every time I come home late, I look for that car. I look for that figure. I haven't seen them since, but I haven't felt safe either. That cold, deliberate stare, those slow, heavy footsteps, they haunt me every night. And I can't help but wonder, what would have happened if they hadn't stopped? I was on a road trip, the kind of trip you take when you need to clear your head after a long stretch of work. I was driving through a rural part of the country, nothing but empty fields and the occasional tree-lined road stretching out for miles. After hours of driving, I felt completely drained, my body aching from sitting for so long. Normally, I stay at chain motels, but everything along the highway seemed booked that night. I drove for what felt like forever, desperate to find anywhere to rest. That's when I saw it, a small bed and breakfast just off the main road. The place looked old but inviting, with a quaint wooden sign swaying in the breeze. It was run by an older couple who seemed friendly enough. They welcomed me warmly, almost too warmly, but I figured they were just glad for the company, given how isolated the place was. When I asked if there were any other guests, they smiled and said I was their only visitor. Something about the way they said it made me uncomfortable, but I told myself I was just tired and overthinking it. The room they gave me was simple, nothing fancy, but it would do for the night. I was about to settle in when I heard footsteps above me. They were faint, just a creak or two, like someone walking carefully. It was odd because the couple said I was alone. I brushed it off, figuring the house was old and maybe just settling, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The next morning, I tried to shake off the weirdness from the night before. The couple had prepared breakfast, a spread of eggs, toast, and coffee. But as I sat down, I noticed something strange. There were 3 dirty plates on the table, as if someone else had been eating. When I asked about it, they exchanged a quick glance, then shrugged it off, saying they just made extra for me. It didn't sit right with me, but I let it go. Then I saw it. An old, worn-out suitcase tucked into the corner of the dining room. I hadn't noticed it before. When I pointed it out, the wife quickly moved it, saying it belonged to a guest who had already left. The way she said it made my skin crawl. Who was this guest? Why hadn't I heard about them before? I couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more deliberate, moving up and down the hallway outside my room. It was no longer just the creaking of an old house. Someone was walking around, but the couple insisted it was just us in the house. My nerves were shot by this point, so I decided to do some exploring. I didn't care if it was inappropriate. I needed answers. I found small things that didn't add up. There were half-used toiletries in the bathroom that hadn't been there before, and a jacket that definitely wasn't mine or the couple's, hanging in a closet. There was also a door at the end of the hall that was locked. Every time I passed it, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like something bad was just behind that door. When I confronted the couple about these things, their friendly demeanor cracked. They became defensive, claiming I was mistaken, that I must have seen things wrong. But they were watching me now, hovering near my room, lingering in the hallway as if waiting for me to slip up. Every time I left my room, they were there, standing just a little too close, their eyes following me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The footsteps were back, and this time they stopped right outside my door. My heart was racing. I knew something was terribly wrong. I got up to check the room, and that's when I found it. A small camera hidden behind a painting on the wall. It was angled directly at the bed. Panic shot through me. What the hell was going on here? I needed to leave, but when I tried to go, the husband was standing by the front door, casually asking if everything was all right. His tone was calm, but his eyes gave away something darker. I made up an excuse, saying I needed some fresh air, but he just stood there, blocking my way. My only option was to go back to my room and pretend nothing was wrong. I locked the door and tried to think. I couldn't just walk out with him watching every move. While I was packing my things, I heard whispering outside my door, muffled voices, the couple talking about what to do next. My chest tightened. They knew I was on to them. I was trapped. The next morning, they left the front door open while bringing in supplies. It was my chance. I grabbed my bag and slipped out quietly, running to my car as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, finally getting the engine started. I sped off down the highway, heart pounding, the house disappearing behind me in the rearview mirror. Even though I'd escaped, the fear didn't leave me. I couldn't stop thinking about the cameras, wondering how long they had been recording me and who else they had filmed. What were they doing with the footage? The violation I felt was intense. I wasn't safe, even out on the open road. They had taken something from me, my privacy, my sense of security. I reported it to the police as soon as I could, but they didn't find anything. The couple vanished, and the bed and breakfast was shut down. But the damage was done. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was still watching. Every time I check into a hotel or an Airbnb now, I scour the room for hidden cameras. It's been years since that night, but it still haunts me, because no matter where I go, I know there's always a chance someone could be watching. Car trouble. I've never shared this story before, but it's been haunting me for months. I can't shake the feeling that I barely escaped something horrible. I'm a 35-year-old woman, and I was driving home late one night after working overtime. It wasn't unusual for me, my job's been crazy lately, and I've been pulling late hours. That night was quiet, too quiet. The roads were empty, and it felt like I hadn't seen another car for miles. It was one of those nights where everything seems darker than usual, like the world's pressing in on you. I'd just had my car serviced a week before, so I wasn't worried about anything mechanical. Still, I started hearing this weird clicking noise as I drove. It wasn't loud, but once I noticed it, I couldn't ignore it. I told myself I was just being paranoid because I was tired. But then, the steering started feeling off, like something wasn't quite right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I could feel it in my gut. Suddenly, the car started slowing down. I pressed the gas pedal, but it felt like the car was struggling to keep moving. I panicked and pulled over to the side of the road. It was pitch black, no streetlights, no houses, just empty roads stretching in both directions. My heart was pounding as I got out to check the car. I looked at the tires, opened the hood, but everything seemed fine at first glance. It didn't make sense. I tried calling roadside assistance, but my phone barely had a signal. That's when the anxiety really kicked in. I stood there, helpless, waiting for my phone to reconnect. And then, out of nowhere, I saw headlights approaching in my rearview mirror. A tow truck. I hadn't even managed to call for help yet, but here was a tow truck. The driver got out and approached me with this weird smile. He said something like, "Looks like you need some help." It didn't sound like a question. I never asked for help, and the way he appeared out of nowhere made me feel sick to my stomach. Something wasn't right. Immediately, I felt dread creep up my spine. His tone was too friendly, too casual for someone just passing by on a deserted road at midnight. He insisted that I should get into his truck while he checked under the hood. "It's cold out here," he said. "You'll be safer in my truck." I hesitated, telling him I'd rather stay by my car. He didn't like that. He kept pushing, trying to convince me it was safer to sit inside his truck while he fixed whatever was wrong with my car. My hands were shaking, but I kept refusing as politely as I could. I didn't want to make him angry, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to stay away from him. The man finally agreed to look under the hood, but kept glancing back at me. The way he looked at me made me feel like prey. I glanced down at my phone, hoping for some kind of miracle, but the signal was still weak. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. He wasn't actually fixing anything. He was just lingering, stalling. It was like he was waiting for something. The whole situation felt wrong, but I couldn't think of a way out. Then I had an idea. I clutched my stomach and told him I felt sick, that I needed to grab something from inside the car. He gave me this odd look but didn't say anything. I slid into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and frantically tried to call for help again. This time, I got through. Roadside assistance picked up, and I explained what was happening. The operator sounded confused. "We haven't dispatched anyone to your location," she said. "There shouldn't be a tow truck there." My blood turned to ice. I watched the man through my rearview mirror, pacing around the car. He looked agitated, like he was waiting for me to unlock the door. My heart was pounding in my ears as I quietly told the operator that I was in danger. They assured me that a real service truck was on its way. The man started knocking on my window, harder this time. "Open the door," he said, his voice no longer friendly. "It's not safe out here alone. Let me fix this, and you can be on your way." I didn't respond, just kept watching him, trying to stay calm. I turned the key, trying to start the car, but it wouldn't turn over. That's when I realized he must have done something to it. He'd sabotaged my car. I glanced down at the tires again. Deep cuts ran along the sidewalls. He had done it. He must have slashed them while I was checking under the hood earlier. Just as I was about to completely lose it, I saw another pair of headlights. The real roadside assistance truck was pulling up behind the tow truck. Relief washed over me, but when I turned back to look at the man, he was gone. The truck, the man, everything had vanished without a trace. The new driver checked my tires and confirmed my worst fear. Someone had deliberately slashed them. He looked at me like he knew what could have happened if they hadn't arrived in time. I drove home in a daze. I couldn't stop thinking about the way the man had looked at me, how persistent he was, how he disappeared the moment the real help arrived. My hands were shaking the entire drive, and my mind kept replaying what could have happened if I had gotten into his truck. It was too terrifying to imagine. Just as I pulled into my driveway, my phone buzzed with a notification. There was a news alert. Several women had gone missing in the area, all last seen on deserted roads late at night. I haven't driven alone at night since. I don't talk about this much, but I wanted to share it here. Trust your instincts and be careful. I was lucky that night, but someone else might not be. That man is still out there. I can't stop thinking about what happened to me last week. I keep playing it over and over in my head, trying to make sense of it. I'm 26, living in a quiet part of town, and I've always felt safe here. Most nights I take the train home from work because I don't own a car. It's usually a peaceful ride. Late at night, not many people are on board, and I enjoy the quiet. But last Tuesday was different. Something about that night still makes me feel uneasy. The train was almost empty. I stepped into one of the carriages, finding it completely silent. It wasn't unusual for that time, but the flickering lights and the faint smell of dampness made the carriage feel wrong somehow. I shrugged it off, trying to convince myself I was just tired from a long day. I sat down, stared out the window as the landscape blurred past, and tried to relax. But the longer I sat there, the more I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We passed through a particularly dark section of town where no one ever gets on or off, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps coming from the next carriage. They were faint, but they were there, and for some reason they made my skin crawl. At the next stop, the doors opened, and 3 men stumbled in. They were loud, obviously drunk, and laughing at something only they found funny. I immediately tensed up. They didn't notice me at first, and I hoped it would stay that way. I kept my head down, scrolling through my phone, trying to seem invisible. But you know how it is. The more you try to avoid something, the more it notices you. One of the men, the tallest, sat down way too close. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at me. His friends kept laughing, making crude jokes about my appearance, and I felt my hands start to shake. I gripped my phone tighter, trying to act like I wasn't bothered, but my heart was pounding. Then, without warning, the man next to me leaned in. "You look like the quiet type," he said, voice low so the others couldn't hear. Quiet ones are always fun to mess with. I froze. He wasn't joking. There was something darker in his tone. The other 2 stood up, blocking the aisle, and I realized that getting out wasn't going to be as simple as I'd hoped. The train kept moving, heading toward more isolated areas. I glanced at the doors, thinking about slipping out at the next stop, but they seemed to pick up on my nervous energy. The taunts grew worse. They started asking me questions, their voices taking on a more menacing tone. One of them leaned forward, smirking. "Where you headed, huh? You look lost." I considered moving to another carriage, but something told me that would just provoke them. Instead, I stayed where I was, my body tense, pretending I couldn't hear them. Finally, the train slowed. I could see the platform approaching. I needed to get off, now. As soon as the doors hissed open, I jumped up, rushing toward the exit. The men reacted too late, shouting after me, but I managed to slip through the doors before they could catch up. For a second, I felt relief, thinking I was in the clear. But when I turned around, I saw them stepping off the train. They were following me. My pulse quickened. The station was deserted. No one was around, and the only sound was the faint hum of the train as it pulled away, leaving me alone with them. I glanced around, trying to find an escape route, but the nearest exit seemed miles away. The station lights flickered above me, casting long shadows on the ground, and I could hear their footsteps behind me, getting closer. I ran. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Their laughter echoed through the empty station, mocking me. I tried every door I passed, but they were all locked. The men were gaining on me, and I felt the panic rise in my throat. Finally, I spotted a stairwell that led to the street. I sprinted toward it, my legs burning with the effort. Halfway down, I stumbled, adrenaline clouding my judgment. I glanced back and saw them closing in. One of them pulled out a knife, and that's when my fear turned into sheer terror. I hit the street, running as fast as I could, but I could still hear them behind me, their footsteps pounding the pavement. Their laughter seemed louder, closer, like they were enjoying the chase. I rounded a corner, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and slammed into someone. For a split second, I thought it was one of them, and I braced myself for the worst. But when I looked up, I realized it was a clerk from a nearby convenience store. He looked just as surprised as I was. Without thinking, I shoved past him and rushed inside the store, gasping for air. The men never followed me in. They disappeared into the night like shadows, leaving me trembling by the counter. The clerk called the police, but by the time they arrived, the men were long gone. I gave a statement, trying to explain what happened, but the officers didn't seem too concerned. One of them told me, "They probably won't come back. Just avoid this area at night." Easier said than done. I left the store and walked home, but every step felt heavy, like I was still being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see them lurking in the shadows, but the street was empty. That night never left me. I avoid taking the train at night now, but sometimes I still hear footsteps behind me when I walk home alone, and every time I turn around expecting to see them. The police couldn't help, and I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there somewhere, watching, waiting. Maybe next time I won't be so lucky. I've always been careful about privacy, especially at night. My apartment is on the ground floor, and I'm painfully aware of how exposed my windows are to anyone walking by. It's a nice neighborhood, quiet and mostly safe, but that doesn't stop me from double-checking every door and window before bed. I moved here a year ago after a rough breakup, thinking the solitude would be good for me. I like my space, and I've always made sure to draw my heavy curtains tight every evening. I've gotten used to the small noises that come with living here. Leaves rustling outside, the occasional sound of footsteps. The first few weeks, every noise made me jump. But over time, I got used to it, convincing myself it was just the normal sounds of a quiet street. Nothing to worry about. At least that's what I kept telling myself until one night when something felt off. I was getting ready for bed, as usual, when I noticed the curtains weren't fully closed. Just a tiny gap, but enough to set off a strange feeling in my chest. I walked over to close them completely, but for a second, I thought I saw movement outside. It was just a blur, maybe a shadow from a passing car. Still, I closed the gap quickly and brushed off the unease. It was probably nothing. I tried to shake the feeling and went to bed, but it took me longer than usual to fall asleep that night. The next evening, I came home after a long day at work, feeling drained and distracted. I pulled the curtains closed, like I always do, but this time I froze. Through the small gap, I saw it again. A shadow. But it wasn't moving. It was standing still, just outside the window. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was probably someone walking by. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself I was tired, my eyes playing tricks on me. I checked the window one last time before heading to bed, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave. That night, I kept hearing faint tapping noises, soft but insistent. Too scared to look, I stayed in bed, hoping it was just a branch brushing against the glass. Over the next few nights, things only got worse. Every time I closed the curtains, I felt like someone was watching me. The noises outside my window, footsteps, tapping, became more frequent. It was driving me crazy. I called a friend and told them everything. They said I was probably overthinking it, that it was nothing. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more paranoid I became. It didn't help that nobody believed me. Then one night, I woke up around 2 a.m. There was a sound, footsteps, unmistakable, right outside my window. I was frozen, too terrified to move. I didn't even want to breathe. My phone was next to me, and I thought about calling the police, but I hesitated. What if it was just my imagination? What if they came and found nothing? I stayed like that for what felt like hours, heart racing, my mind racing even faster. Finally, I built up the courage to peek through the curtains, just a tiny bit. Nothing. The footsteps had stopped. There was no one outside, at least that I could see, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I barely slept that night, and every little noise made me jump. The next day, I decided to install a second lock on my door and check the windows obsessively. Every night, I made sure the curtains were fully closed, but no matter how tightly I drew them, I couldn't shake the feeling. The tapping started up again, louder this time. I tried to ignore it at first, but one night, it got so bad that I couldn't take it anymore. I texted my friend, practically begging for advice, and this time they told me to call the police. I didn't want to, but I did. When the officers arrived, they looked around but found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been outside. They suggested it could have been a prank or even a branch against the window, though I knew better. They recommended I set up a security camera for peace of mind. I figured it wouldn't hurt, so I had a camera installed outside my window. For a couple of nights, things seemed normal again. The noises stopped, and I thought maybe I could relax. But then, one evening, I decided to check the footage. I don't know why I did it, but something inside me told me to look. That's when I saw it. In the footage from a few nights ago, around 1 a.m., there was someone standing right outside my window. A figure just standing there, looking directly at the camera. My stomach dropped. The figure didn't move, didn't do anything, just stared, as if they knew exactly where the camera was. And then, after what felt like an eternity, they turned and disappeared into the shadows. I replayed the footage over and over, feeling sick. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't my imagination. Someone had been watching me. The police reviewed the footage, but they couldn't identify the person. They told me it was probably a prankster, maybe a kid from the neighborhood. My neighbors didn't seem to care either, brushing it off as harmless. But harmless or not, I no longer felt safe. My apartment, which had once felt like my sanctuary, now felt like a trap. I checked the curtains constantly, even during the day. It's been a few weeks since then, and I haven't seen the figure again. But every night, I still feel watched. I check the curtains obsessively, terrified of finding them slightly open. The police told me not to worry, but I can't shake the feeling that whoever was watching me is still out there, waiting. Maybe I'll move. But the thought lingers. What if they find me again? Title: Lost in the Woods. I've never been much of an outdoors person. Hiking, camping, all of that, just not my thing. But a few months ago, a group of friends from college invited me on a weekend hiking trip. It sounded like a good way to disconnect from work and all the stress, so I figured why not? Plus, it'd been a while since I'd spent time with them. They were all excited, talking about how it would be nice to be off the grid for a couple of days, away from the city. I wasn't as sure, but I went along with it. The place we were hiking was really remote, like no signal for miles remote. When we arrived, I remember feeling uneasy. We parked the car at a small, almost abandoned-looking parking lot, and it was just trees as far as I could see. One of the park rangers made a passing comment about keeping track of time, but I didn't think much of it at the moment. The forest was unnaturally quiet, but I chalked that up to it being so far from civilization. I joked with my friends about how easy it would be to get lost, and they laughed. Little did I know, that joke would come back to haunt me. On the second day, we decided to split up for a bit. It wasn't supposed to be for long, just an hour or two of exploring different trails before meeting back at a clearing. I was paired with Mark, the one friend I trusted to know his way around. At first, everything seemed fine. We hiked for a while, talking about random things, but after a bit, I started noticing something odd. There were no trail markers, no signs at all. Mark reassured me, saying we were fine. But after another hour, even he started to look unsure. That's when I realized we were lost. We argued for a bit. I wanted to head back the way we came, but Mark was convinced we could find our way by pushing forward. My phone had no signal, and we didn't bring a map. Relying on GPS was our first mistake. We kept walking until we came across a fork in the path. Mark wanted to check it out, leaving me to wait. I watched him disappear into the woods, thinking he'd be back in a few minutes. But he didn't come back. I waited longer, calling out his name, but nothing. I told myself he'd return soon. As the sun began to set, though, my anxiety kicked in. I shouted again, louder, but my voice just echoed back. It was like the forest was swallowing my calls. That's when it hit me. I was alone. I panicked. I didn't want to admit it, but I was terrified. My first thought was to try and walk back, but every path I took looked wrong. The trees all blurred together, and nothing seemed familiar anymore. Then, I saw something on the ground. A torn piece of fabric, dark and dirty. It looked like part of the shirt Mark had been wearing. My stomach dropped. What the hell happened to him? I called out again, but only heard the rustling of leaves. I felt like I was being watched, and every sound in the forest sent my heart racing. I turned on my flashlight, but it kept flickering like the battery was dying. As darkness fell, the forest became a completely different place. Every snap of a twig felt like something or someone was right behind me. After walking aimlessly for what felt like hours, I stumbled upon something I didn't expect. An old cabin, deep in the woods. It looked abandoned, but at that point I was desperate for shelter. I hesitated, but the thought of spending the night outside was worse, so I went in. Inside, the air was thick, stale. It was clear someone had been living there recently. There were empty food cans, a sleeping bag, and scattered belongings. But what really freaked me out was a piece of bloody clothing hanging over a chair. On the table was a large hunting knife, caked in what looked like dried blood. My heart pounded in my chest. Someone dangerous had been here. Or worse, someone could still be here. That's when I heard it. Footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate. Someone was approaching the cabin. I froze, trying to stay as quiet as possible. My breath caught in my throat as the footsteps got closer. I backed into the shadows, hiding behind a large cabinet as the door creaked open. In the darkness, I saw a figure enter. They moved through the room, searching for something, but I couldn't make out much. When they stopped near the table with the bloody knife, I thought I was done for. I barely breathed. I kept telling myself, "Don't move. Don't make a sound." The figure stood there for what felt like an eternity. And just as they were about to leave, my flashlight, which I had stuffed into my backpack, flickered on. Just for a second, but it was enough. The figure stopped. They turned toward the light, their body tensed. I thought this was it. They'd seen me. I was frozen, heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. Then, without warning, they bolted out of the cabin. The door slammed shut, and I heard them running off into the woods. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was too scared they might come back. When I finally worked up the nerve to leave, it was still pitch black outside. I had no idea where I was, but I started walking, just hoping to find my way back. Eventually, I saw a flicker of light in the distance, a campfire. It was my friends. They had been searching for me for hours. I was too shaken to explain everything, but I knew I had to get out of those woods. Even though I made it back, I can't shake the feeling that someone is still out there, watching. I never told my friends about the cabin or the person I saw. I don't know if they'd even believe me. Since that trip, I haven't gone hiking. I don't think I ever will again. But sometimes I dream about that cabin, and in those dreams the figure always turns around to face me, and they're smiling. It was late. I had just left my friend's house after hanging out a bit too long, and now I was driving home alone through the empty roads of the countryside. I live in a pretty rural area, so it's not unusual to go miles without seeing another car, especially at night. The road stretched ahead, just me and the dark, no streetlights, no signs of life. As I drove, I noticed my gas light came on. Great. There wasn't much between my friend's place and home, but I knew there was a small old gas station along the way. It was one of those rundown places, almost forgotten by time, but I didn't have a choice. I pulled in, the neon open sign flickering weakly. The place was deserted, no other cars, no one inside that I could see. But I told myself it was fine. I just needed gas. The whole place felt off, though. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, like someone was lurking just out of sight. I brushed it off. It was late. I was tired. I put the nozzle in my tank and tried to focus on filling up as quickly as possible. Then I saw him. A man approached out of nowhere. I didn't hear him pull up. One moment I was alone, and the next, there he was, walking toward me. He looked rough, probably in his late 40s, with dirty clothes and a scruffy beard. Something about the way he moved made me nervous. Too slow, like he had all the time in the world. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his voice friendly, but it didn't match the look in his eyes. He kept glancing at my car, then back at me. I tried to smile and told him I was just passing through, not giving too many details. My gut screamed at me to finish and get out of there. As soon as I paid, I jumped back into my car and took off. My heart was racing. I didn't even know why I was so freaked out, but I just had a bad feeling about that guy. A few miles down the road, my tire blew out. The car jerked to the side, and I had no choice but to pull over. The road was pitch black, no lights, no traffic. Panic started to creep in. I got out to check the tire. It was shredded. That's when I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. The same truck. The man from the gas station was pulling up behind me. My stomach dropped. He got out of his truck, still wearing that same unnerving smile. "Need some help?" he asked, too casual, like this was all normal. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. The way he kept looking at my car, taking his time, it felt like he was waiting for something. "I'm good," I said, pulling out my phone, but there was no signal. I was stuck. He took a step closer, insisting that he had tools in his truck. My heart was pounding. I knew I had to get back in the car. I muttered something about waiting for roadside assistance and locked myself inside. My hands were shaking. I kept glancing at the man, who just stood there smiling. His eyes didn't leave my car. That's when I noticed the lug nuts on the back tire. They looked loose, too loose, like they had been tampered with. It hit me like a punch to the gut. He must have done something at the gas station. He had been following me, waiting for this moment. I was trapped. He started tapping on the window, his smile gone now. "Open the door," he said, his voice low and serious. My mind was racing. I didn't know what to do. Could I drive on a flat tire? I didn't care. I had to try. I started the engine, and the car groaned forward, but barely. The tire was too damaged. I could hear it dragging on the road, metal screeching against asphalt. The man didn't seem worried. He just stepped back and watched me struggle, like he was enjoying it. I tried to push the car faster, but it wouldn't go. I was only a few feet down the road when I had to stop again. He walked back to his truck, slow, deliberate. My heart felt like it was going to explode. Then I saw him pull something out of the truck bed, a crowbar. He started walking toward my car again, this time with a purpose. My breath came in short gasps as I slammed the doors shut, locking them. The crowbar tapped against the window lightly, like he was teasing me. My mind raced with ideas. Should I honk? Try to signal for help? But deep down, I knew no one was around. There was no one to help me. The way he was taking his time, it made everything worse. He didn't need to rush because he knew I had nowhere to go. Tap, tap. The crowbar hit the window again, harder this time. I flinched. I knew it wouldn't hold much longer. I was shaking. My mind kept flashing back to the gas station, to the moment I saw him. How did I let this happen? How did I get stuck here? Another tap. This time the glass cracked. I'm typing this now because I don't know what else to do. My phone still doesn't have service and I can hear him outside. The glass just cracked and I'm not sure how much longer I have. I want to warn anyone reading this. Don't stop at strange gas stations in the middle of nowhere. Trust your gut. I should have left as soon as I saw him. I can hear him. The Airbnb, I don't usually share stuff like this, but something happened to me a few months ago that I still can't shake. My girlfriend Emily and I rented an Airbnb for a weekend getaway, thinking it would be nice to escape from our jobs in the city. We booked this small, isolated cottage in the woods, a perfect break from the stress. Or at least, that's what we thought. The drive out there was peaceful. The place looked like the pictures, rustic, cozy, tucked away from the world. The host seemed friendly when we met him briefly. He gave us the key and mentioned a few things, like how the house was old and we might hear some noise from the pipes. It seemed like a weird thing to bring up, but I didn't think much of it. There was also this strange smell inside, like damp wood. But again, I brushed it off. My phone kept losing signal as soon as we got there, but I figured it was just because of how remote the place was. The first night, everything seemed fine, mostly. We were tired, so we just made dinner, watched a movie, and went to bed early. But just before I fell asleep, I thought I heard some faint scratching in the walls. At first, I didn't really pay attention. Old house, old pipes, right? I figured it was just animals or maybe the plumbing acting up. Still, it left me feeling uneasy, like something was off. The next day, we spent most of the afternoon hiking in the nearby forest trying to relax. It was late by the time we got back, and as soon as we settled in for the night, the noises started again. Only this time, it wasn't just scratching. It was louder, almost like something or someone was moving inside the walls. Emily heard it too and asked me if I thought it could be animals. I didn't want to freak her out, so I told her it was probably just the pipes, but I wasn't so sure anymore. We texted the host and he replied almost immediately, saying it's an old house, nothing to worry about. Just the pipes. Something about the way he brushed it off made me feel worse, like he wasn't telling us everything. I tried to sleep, but the noises got louder, more deliberate. I started to feel like someone was whispering, But when I asked Emily if she heard it, she didn't respond. She was already asleep. I laid there, wide awake, listening. I knew that wasn't the pipes. I couldn't take it anymore. So I got out of bed and started looking around the house. That's when I noticed something strange. There were these small vents along the walls, low to the ground, perfectly square, and placed in odd spots, even in the bathroom. I crouched down to look inside one of them, but it was pitch black. I couldn't see a thing, but I felt wrong, like those vents weren't meant for air. My stomach turned. The next morning, I told Emily I thought we should leave early. She agreed, and we started packing. When I opened the front door, the handle felt sticky. I looked down and saw a small smudge of something dark on the doorframe. It looked like dried blood. I checked the frame closer and noticed deep scratches, like someone had tried to force the door open from the outside. That was it for me. We needed to leave. Now. We were almost ready to go when Emily found something even worse. Under the bed in the guest room was a crawlspace hatch. It wasn't locked. In fact, it was slightly open, like someone had been in it recently. I grabbed a flashlight and shined it into the crawlspace, but I couldn't see much. The sight of that open hatch made my skin crawl. I didn't want to know what was in there. I just wanted out. We rushed to finish packing, but as we did, the noises in the walls started up again, louder than before. This time, I knew it wasn't just the pipes. I could hear footsteps above us, in the attic. Someone was up there. I grabbed Emily's arm and we ran for the front door, but it wouldn't open. The handle twisted, but it felt jammed. I tried again, but nothing. Panic hit me. Emily pulled out her phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The footsteps grew louder, closer, like whoever or whatever was up there was running toward us. My heart was pounding. I grabbed a chair and smashed it through one of the windows. We climbed out, cutting ourselves on the glass, and sprinted to the car. As I started the engine and sped away, Emily looked back at the house. "Oh my God," she whispered. "There's someone in the window." I didn't look back. I couldn't. We drove for hours, not stopping until we found a small diner in the middle of nowhere. Neither of us said much. We were both shaking, covered in cuts from the glass. We ended up staying in a cheap motel that night, but neither of us slept. The next day, Airbnb sent me a notification asking if we wanted to leave a review. Emily said we should report what happened, but honestly, I didn't want to deal with it. I was just glad we got out of there alive. A few days later, I got another message from the host. "Hope you enjoyed your stay. Come back anytime." That was months ago. Recently, I did some research on the house and found out that the previous owner had been arrested for spying on guests. He had installed hidden cameras and crawl spaces all over the house. I don't know if he's still out there, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear those whispers. And I wonder if someone, somewhere, is still watching us. I'll never forget that weekend. It's always in the back of my mind, like a shadow that won't leave.